She undressed for a medical exam, and the doctor turned out to be her first love from 12 years ago. Welcome, everyone. I'm your storyteller, James, and I'm so happy to have you here with me today. Before we dive into today's story, let's take a moment to center our hearts with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this moment, for the gift of life, and for the opportunity to connect through the power of stories. May the words shared today bring comfort, hope, and inspiration to everyone listening. Bless each person watching, touch their hearts, and remind them that love, grace, and second chances are always possible with you. Amen. Now, let me ask you something. Do you believe that sometimes a second chance can be even better than the first? Can love truly be stronger the second time around? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please comment below and let me know how you feel about second chances. Today's story is very special. It's filled with love, redemption, and the beauty of finding your way back to the person meant for you. I promise it will touch your soul in a way that stays with you long after you've heard it. Please stay until the end because this story carries a message that could change the way you see love and forgiveness forever. Your presence here means everything to me, so please let me know you're here by commenting "present" below. I want to feel that connection with you, and I'm truly grateful for every single one of you joining me today. Now, let's get comfortable and dive into this beautiful story together. Let's begin. Lisa's hands trembled as she stepped into the hospital, the coolness of the air-conditioned hallway biting into her skin as she clutched the appointment slip tightly in her hand. Her breath was uneven, her chest rising and falling as anxiety crawled through her veins. She hated hospitals. The sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead always made her stomach turn. But today, it wasn't just the clinical environment making her uneasy. Her heart was hammering in her chest, an unsettling feeling swirling in the pit of her stomach, though she couldn't quite place why. The nurse at the front desk had directed her toward the examination room, and now here she was, perched at the edge of the white examination bed, the crinkling paper beneath her thighs doing nothing to ease her growing discomfort. Her long, beautifully braided hair cascaded down her back, each neat strand perfectly woven, framing her face in a way that highlighted her wide, expressive brown eyes. Her features were striking, a delicate nose, full lips, and high cheekbones that made heads turn wherever she went. But right now, her beauty was overshadowed by the nervous tension radiating from her body. Her legs swung slightly, her heels tapping the floor as her gaze flicked toward the closed door. She inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. Just a routine checkup, she reminded herself. Nothing serious. But no matter how much she tried to calm her racing thoughts, her heart wouldn't stop its frantic pace. Suddenly, the door handle twisted, the soft click of the latch making her head snap up. Her breath caught in her throat as the door swung open, and that's when her heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp white lab coat. His dark hair was slightly tousled, the sharp lines of his jaw and the deep green of his eyes making him look like he had just stepped off the cover of a magazine. His gaze locked with hers, and his face froze in shock. Lisa. The sound of her name coming from his lips, low and rich with disbelief, sent a shiver through her spine. Lisa's mouth parted, but no sound came out. It couldn't be. Her mind raced, her eyes widening as recognition settled into her chest like a heavy weight. Mike. Her first love. Her breath hitched as memories flooded her mind in rapid flashes. The warmth of his arms wrapped around her beneath the stars. The stolen kisses they had shared as teenagers. The way he used to whisper promises of forever into her ear as they lay tangled together after countless passionate nights. It had been 12 years since fate cruelly ripped them apart, 12 years since she had last seen his face. But now, here he was, standing right in front of her. The room seemed to shrink around them, the silence pressing down as they stared at each other, frozen in the weight of the past, crashing over them both. Mike's eyes softened, though the shock in them was still raw. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Lisa," he repeated, softer this time, as if saying her name might make the moment more real. Her throat tightened, her mind spinning. How was this even possible? She had spent years convincing herself that what they had was gone forever, that the love they shared was just a bittersweet memory she had locked away deep inside her heart. And yet, here he was, older, more mature, his once youthful charm now replaced with a rugged sophistication that made her heart ache. His eyes searched hers as if trying to confirm that she was really there. She swallowed hard, her hands curling into fists on her lap. "Mike," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. A flicker of a smile touched his lips, but it was faint, guarded by the weight of time and unspoken history between them. I didn't expect to see you here," he murmured. She shook her head slowly, her braids shifting over her shoulder. "Neither did I." Her gaze dropped to the stethoscope hanging around his neck, the silver gleam of it catching the light. He was a doctor now. The boy who once dreamed of saving lives had actually made it happen. Pride swelled in her chest, mingled with the sharp sting of loss. How had they ended up here? Mike's hand brushed his jaw, his thumb skimming over the light stubble there. "You're here for an exam?" he asked gently, though his voice carried an undertone of disbelief, as if he still couldn't believe she was real. Lisa nodded stiffly. "Yeah, just a checkup." Mike's gaze darkened slightly, his protective instincts clearly surfacing. "Anything serious?" She shook her head quickly. "Number just routine." He exhaled a quiet breath of relief and took another step toward her, his gaze never breaking from hers. For a moment, Lisa forgot where she was. Her mind was still stuck in the past, back to the summer nights they spent lying in the grass, holding hands and dreaming about the future. She remembered the way his lips felt against her skin, the way he used to say her name like it was sacred. But those dreams had been shattered when Mike's father took a job overseas, tearing them apart just as they were falling deeper in love. Neither of them had been strong enough to fight the distance. But now he was standing here, close enough to touch. "It's been a long time," Mike said softly. Lisa's eyes lifted to his. "Yeah," she breathed. His smile was faint but genuine. "You look beautiful." Heat crept into her cheeks. "You don't look too bad yourself." His gaze softened, a quiet intensity settling behind his eyes. "I thought about you, over the years." Her chest tightened painfully. "I tried not to think about you," she whispered. Mike's brows furrowed slightly, his lips pressing together as a shadow of sadness crossed his face. He hesitated, his hand reaching toward her before pulling back at the last second. "Maybe, after this exam, we could catch up." Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to say yes, wanted to feel the warmth of his hand in hers again, but fear coiled in her chest. She had been hurt before. She wasn't sure she could open that door again. Still, as she sat there, staring into the eyes of the man she once loved more than anything, she realized that maybe fate had given them another chance for a reason. "Maybe," she said softly. Mike's lips curved into a small smile. He took a breath and moved toward her, his hands warm and steady as he began the exam. His touch was professional, yet gentle, but every time his fingers brushed her skin, her heart jumped. And in that small, sterile room, surrounded by the ghosts of their past, Lisa couldn't help but wonder if this fateful encounter was the start of something she never dared to hope for, a second chance at love. Mike took a deep breath, forcing himself to steady his hands as he reached for the stethoscope hanging around his neck. His heart was racing, and it wasn't because of the routine nature of the exam. His gaze drifted toward Lisa, who sat quietly on the examination table, her long, beautifully braided hair cascading down her back like silk. The soft light of the room seemed to highlight the flawless glow of her brown skin, and her wide, soulful brown eyes were watching him carefully, guarded yet vulnerable. He swallowed hard, trying to suppress the surge of emotions threatening to break free inside him. It had been 12 years since he last saw her, but now that she was sitting in front of him, it felt like no time had passed at all. His fingers brushed lightly against her wrist as he checked her pulse, and the moment their skin connected, a jolt of electricity shot through him, sharp and immediate. His eyes flicked up to hers, and for a second, neither of them breathed. Lisa's pulse quickened beneath his fingertips, and he could tell that she felt it too. He pressed his lips together, fighting to maintain the professionalism expected of him, but it was impossible. How could he stay composed when the woman he had once loved with every fiber of his being was sitting right there? Her scent filling his senses, her gaze stirring up memories he had buried long ago. His mind spiraled back to the past, to the warm summer nights they had spent beneath the stars, laughing and holding hands as if the world belonged to just the two of them. He remembered the way her smile lit up his entire life, how her laughter was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, and the nights, oh God, the nights. He remembered the feel of her body pressed against his beneath the moonlight, the way her breath hitched when he whispered her name, the way their hearts had beaten as one as they made promises of forever. But forever never came. Life had torn them apart, pulling him away to medical school and dragging her down a separate path. He had thought of her every day since then, wondering where she was, if she was happy, if she had found someone else. But now that she was sitting here, her pulse thrumming beneath his fingers, he realized just how much he had missed her. Missed this feeling. Lisa's eyes softened as she watched him, and he could see the flicker of old emotions swimming beneath the surface. She was trying to stay guarded, but he knew her too well. He could see the way her breath hitched when he touched her, the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. "I never thought I'd see you again," Mike whispered, his voice rough with emotion as his thumb lingered against the delicate curve of her wrist. Her eyes widened slightly and her lips trembled. "Neither did I," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the floor as if looking at him was too much. Mike exhaled slowly, willing himself to focus on the exam, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the stethoscope and leaned closer. "Deep breath," he murmured. Lisa obeyed, her chest rising beneath the thin fabric of her blouse. His eyes flicked to the graceful curve of her collarbone, the soft rise and fall of her breathing, stirring something possessive and tender inside him. He moved the stethoscope across her chest, his fingers brushing the warmth of her skin. He shouldn't be feeling this way. It was a simple medical exam, but every touch felt intimate, every second charged with unspoken emotion. He could feel her body tense beneath his touch, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her gaze lifted to his, and for a moment, the room faded away. "You're okay," he said softly, though his voice betrayed the storm of emotion beneath it. He pulled back slightly, forcing himself to breathe. "You're in perfect health." A soft smile touched her lips. "That's good to know." Mike's jaw tightened as he dropped the stethoscope back around his neck, his eyes never leaving hers. He hesitated, knowing he was crossing a line, but he couldn't stop himself. "Lisa." Her name rolled off his tongue like a prayer, and she shivered at the sound of it. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze darkening with quiet intensity. "When this exam is over, could we talk sometime about us?" Her breath hitched, her eyes widening slightly as his words hung in the air between them. Her lips parted, but she hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. Mike's heart hammered painfully. He had never stopped thinking about her, never stopped loving her, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes, the unspoken fear of reopening old wounds. "Mike," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know it's been a long time, and I know I have no right to ask, but seeing you again..." He shook his head slightly, his green eyes shining with vulnerability. "It's like I'm breathing for the first time in years." Her gaze softened, her lips trembling. She wanted to say yes, he could feel it, but fear was holding her back. He reached out, his fingertips grazing her hand. "Just dinner. No pressure. Just to talk." Lisa's breath quickened as his hand curled around hers, his touch warm and steady. She lifted her gaze, and for a second, the vulnerability in her eyes nearly broke him. Finally, she smiled, soft and hesitant, but real. "Maybe," she whispered. Relief surged through Mike's chest. His thumb brushed over her knuckles as he smiled softly. "I'll take maybe." The tension in the room softened slightly, though the undercurrent of unresolved feelings still lingered between them. Mike pulled back reluctantly, his hand sliding away from hers as he stepped toward the door. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face as if memorizing every delicate feature. "I'll see you soon," he said quietly, his voice full of quiet promise. Lisa's eyes softened, and as he walked away, her heart hammered in her chest. She watched him leave, her mind spinning with the flood of emotions crashing through her. She had thought their story was over, but now it felt like fate was handing them a second chance. And deep down, despite the fear in her heart, she knew she wasn't ready to let it slip away. Mike couldn't sleep that night. His mind was consumed by the image of Lisa sitting across from him in that examination room, her wide, soulful brown eyes searching his face, the delicate tremble in her voice when she had said his name. He had thought that after 12 years apart, the feelings he once had for her would have dulled, softened with time, but they hadn't. If anything, seeing her again had reignited a fire that had never truly gone out. He sat up in bed, his hand running through his tousled dark hair as he stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Where had she been all these years? Had she moved on? Had someone else held her in the way he used to? His jaw tightened at the thought, a sharp pang of jealousy cutting through his chest. No, he couldn't lose her again. He had been given a second chance, a chance he never expected, and he wasn't going to let it slip away this time. Without giving himself time to overthink, he reached for his phone and opened a blank message. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he finally typed, "Lisa, would you meet me for coffee tomorrow, just to catch up? Please." His heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the message. He almost deleted it, almost convinced himself that it was too soon, that it was pointless. But then his thumb hit send. He stared at the phone, waiting, his heart racing. A minute passed, then another. Just as he was about to give up, his phone buzzed. He sucked in a sharp breath as he opened the message. Okay. His pulse quickened. He read the word over and over again, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The next day, Mike arrived early at the coffee shop. He sat by the window, his leg bouncing nervously as he checked his watch. When the door opened, his gaze lifted instantly, and his breath caught in his throat. Lisa walked in, and the world seemed to shift. She was stunning, more beautiful than he remembered, if that was even possible. Her brown skin glowed in the soft light, and her braided hair cascaded over her shoulder in elegant waves. She wore a soft beige sweater that hugged her curves perfectly, and her wide brown eyes scanned the room until they landed on him. A nervous smile tugged at her lips as she approached the table. "Hi," she said softly. Mike stood immediately, his gaze never leaving hers. "Hey." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." She slid into the seat, her fingers brushing her hair behind her ear. Mike's eyes followed the movement, captivated by the delicate curve of her neck, the soft shimmer of her skin. "It's been a long time," she said after a moment, her voice steady but cautious. Mike smiled, his green eyes darkening with warmth. "Yeah, too long." A waitress approached, and Mike ordered coffee for both of them. As they waited, he studied her face, the soft curve of her lips, the way her eyes sparkled even when she was nervous. "You look amazing," he said softly. Her cheeks flushed and her eyes dropped to the table. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to." His gaze was intense, his voice low. "I'm saying it because it's true." She lifted her eyes to his, and the air between them shifted. The waitress returned with their drinks, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mike leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I need to know, where have you been all these years, Lisa?" Her lips parted slightly, and a shadow passed through her eyes. "After you left for medical school, I stayed behind. I waited for a while, hoping you'd come back. But when you didn't..." She shrugged, her smile tinged with sadness. "Life went on, I guess." Mike's chest tightened painfully. "I wanted to come back," he said quietly. "But my schedule, med school, consumed everything. And then when I finally graduated, He shook his head, his eyes clouded with regret. "I didn't know how to reach you." Lisa's gaze softened. "You could have tried harder," she whispered. His jaw tightened. "I know, and I regret it every day." His hand slid across the table, his fingers brushing over hers. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "I missed you, Lisa," he said, his voice raw. "Not a day went by that I didn't think about you, about us." Her eyes shimmered with emotion. "Mike." He curled his fingers around her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "It feels like yesterday," he whispered. "Sitting here with you. It's like no time has passed." Her lips trembled. "But it has." "I know." His eyes darkened. "But maybe fate is giving us a second chance." She inhaled sharply, her gaze searching his face. "And what if it's too late?" He shook his head, his grip tightening around her hand. "It's not." His voice was low and sure. "I'm not letting you slip away again." Her heart thudded painfully. Her hand curled around his, and their fingers intertwined as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Mike, give me a chance," he whispered. "Let me make it up to you." Her breath quickened, her wide brown eyes shimmering with vulnerability. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, finally, her lips curved into a soft smile. "Maybe," she said. Mike's chest tightened with relief. His thumb brushed over her hand again, and a slow smile spread across his face. "I'll take maybe." They sat there for another hour, talking and laughing like they used to. The walls between them began to crumble, piece by piece, as they reminisced about old memories. Summer nights spent beneath the stars, lazy afternoons lying in the grass, the way they used to finish each other's sentences. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and Mike could feel the familiar pull, the magnetic force that had always existed between them. When Lisa finally stood to leave, Mike walked her to the door. The rain had started to fall lightly outside, and he hesitated for a moment before reaching out and brushing a lock of her hair behind her ear. Her eyes lifted to his, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. "Can I see you again?" he asked softly. Lisa hesitated, her lips parting. Then she smiled. "Maybe." Mike grinned. "I'm starting to like that word." She laughed softly, her eyes bright despite the rain. Then, before he could stop himself, he leaned in and kissed her forehead. Her breath hitched, and when he pulled back, her eyes were wide and soft. "Good night, Lisa," he said. She smiled. "Good night, Mike." He watched her walk away, his heart thundering in his chest. As the rain fell around him, Mike knew one thing for sure. He wasn't letting her slip away again. Not this time. Mike couldn't shake the feeling that fate was giving him a second chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. After their coffee meeting, he couldn't stop thinking about Lisa. Her smile, the way her hand had fit so perfectly in his, the warmth in her eyes when she had whispered maybe. He had spent so many years convincing himself that what they had was over, that it was impossible to go back. But now, seeing her again, feeling that magnetic pull between them, it was clear that nothing had truly changed. His heart still belonged to her. That evening, Mike called Lisa and asked if she would meet him. "Where?" she had asked, her voice soft and hesitant. "You'll see," he had replied. An hour later, Mike stood beneath the dark velvet sky, the stars scattered like diamonds above him, waiting at the place where so many of their memories were etched into his soul, the quiet park where they had shared their first kiss. His heart pounded in his chest as he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, and his breath caught. Lisa stood there beneath the moonlight, the soft glow illuminating her stunning brown skin. Her braided hair was pulled over one shoulder, and her wide, soulful eyes sparkled with uncertainty. She wore a simple blue dress that hugged her curves perfectly, and Mike had to remind himself to breathe as he watched her walk toward him. "Mike," she said, her voice breathless. He smiled. "You came. You didn't give me much of a choice," she teased, her lips curving into a small smile. "You sounded pretty determined." "I am," he said softly. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers as he guided her toward the weathered wooden bench where they used to sit all those years ago. He sat down and gently tugged her hand until she sat beside him. For a moment, they just sat there in silence, the sounds of the night surrounding them, the soft rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the cool whisper of the breeze against their skin. "Do you remember how we used to sneak out to meet here?" Mike asked, his voice low and warm. Lisa smiled, her eyes misting with memories. "How could I forget?" Her gaze drifted toward the sky. "You used to say that if we sat here long enough, we'd be able to count every star." "Yeah," Mike said, a fond smile tugging at his lips. "You always got bored after counting 20. "Because I was too busy looking at you," she whispered, her cheeks flushing softly. Mike's heart thudded painfully. He lifted a hand to her face, brushing his thumb along her cheekbone. Her skin was warm and soft beneath his touch, and he saw her breath hitch. "You were always the most beautiful thing I ever saw," he said quietly. Her eyes widened, shimmering with emotion. "Mike." His gaze darkened with intensity as his thumb traced the curve of her jaw. "I thought I lost you forever," he whispered. "But you're here now, and I'm not letting you slip away again." She swallowed hard, her breathing uneven. "It's been 12 years, she whispered. "So much has changed." "Not this," Mike said. His hand slid into her hair and he leaned closer, his face inches from hers. His green eyes burned with emotion as they searched hers. "Not how I feel about you." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Mike's heart tightened painfully. "I missed you," she breathed. "God, Mike, I missed you so much." He smiled, his eyes softening. "I know. I missed you too." Slowly, carefully, he leaned in, giving her time to pull away. But she didn't. Her eyes fluttered shut, and her lips parted slightly. Mike's breath mingled with hers as his mouth hovered over hers for a single heartbeat. Then, finally, he kissed her. The moment their lips touched, the world seemed to melt away. The kiss was slow and deep, years of longing and unspoken feelings pouring into it. Lisa's hand curled into the front of his shirt, and Mike slid his other hand into her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss. Her lips were soft and warm, and when she sighed against his mouth, a low groan escaped his throat. He kissed her like he was starving for her, like he had spent 12 years aching for this moment. And he had. His hand traced down her back, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed together. Lisa responded with equal intensity, her fingers threading through his dark hair as her mouth moved beneath his with sweet, desperate urgency. When Mike finally pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, they were both breathless. Lisa's eyes were dark with emotion as she looked at him. "Mike, it's not too late," he whispered. "We can have this again. We can have everything we lost." She searched his face, her eyes shimmering with vulnerability. "But what if it's not the same?" "It's not," he said softly. "It's better." His thumb brushed over her lower lip, and her breath shuddered. "Because this time I know exactly what I'm fighting for, and I'm not letting go of you again." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Mike kissed it away. Her lips trembled beneath his touch. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere this time." He cupped her face, his gaze steady and sure. "Trust me, Lisa. Let me love you the way I should have all those years ago." Her eyes fluttered shut, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. When her eyes opened again, her gaze softened. "Okay," she whispered. His heart soared. He smiled, his thumb caressing her cheek. "Okay? Okay," she repeated, her voice steadier. Mike's smile widened and he kissed her forehead. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close until her head rested against his chest. They sat there beneath the stars, wrapped in each other, the night surrounding them with quiet intimacy. Mike pressed his lips to her hair, his eyes closing. He had thought this moment was lost forever, that they had missed their chance. But now, as he held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, he knew without a doubt, this was just the beginning. He wasn't letting her go this time. He was going to love her, protect her, and cherish her with every breath he had left. And as Lisa's arms slid around his waist and she sighed contentedly against his chest, Mike smiled. They had found their way back to each other. And this time, it was forever. Mike couldn't get Lisa out of his mind. Ever since that night at the park when their lips had met under the stars, something inside him had shifted. He had thought he could control himself, keep a safe distance, but he was fooling himself. He was already too far gone. Lisa was in his blood, in his veins, in every breath he took. He woke up thinking about her, and he fell asleep dreaming of her. The way her wide brown eyes had looked at him with a mix of vulnerability and longing haunted him. He was becoming obsessed, drawn to her with a magnetic pull he couldn't resist. It started small. He would find reasons to check in on her. He sent her a text the morning after the park. "Did you sleep well?" She had replied with a simple yes, followed by a shy, smiley face emoji, and that tiny gesture had filled his chest with warmth. But that small taste wasn't enough. He wanted more. He found excuses to call her, asking about her health, reminding her about the follow-up exam he had scheduled for her, even though he knew it wasn't necessary. Then, one afternoon, he showed up at her house unannounced. Lisa opened the door, her eyes widening when she saw him standing there with a bouquet of white roses in his hands. She was wearing a soft pink dress that hugged her curves, her braids cascading over her shoulder. Mike's breath hitched at how stunning she looked. "Mike?" she said, her voice filled with confusion. He smiled, holding out the flowers. "These are for you." Her eyes widened. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said simply. Her fingers brushed his as she took the flowers, and he felt that electric jolt race through him again. She inhaled their scent, her lips parting slightly as a faint blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you." Mike smiled, his gaze never leaving hers. "Can I come in?" She hesitated for a moment, but then she stepped aside, letting him in. He followed her into the small but cozy living room. She placed the flowers in a vase on the coffee table, her fingers trembling slightly. Mike watched her with darkened eyes, his chest tightening. He was getting in too deep. He knew it, but he didn't care. He wanted her. All of her. "I feel like you're trying too hard," Lisa said suddenly, turning toward him with guarded eyes. "It's been 12 years, Mike. Why now?" He stepped closer, his eyes dark with emotion. "Because I lost you once," he said, his voice low and intense. "And I'm not going to lose you again." Her breath hitched as he lifted a hand to her cheek. His thumb brushed her soft skin, and she closed her eyes briefly. "Mike, do you have any idea how many times I've thought about you?" he whispered. "How many nights I lay awake wondering where you were, if you were happy, if you were thinking about me?" Her eyes opened slowly, shimmering with vulnerability. "I thought you moved on." He smiled faintly, his hand sliding down to her neck. "I tried, but no one ever measured up to you, Lisa." She swallowed hard, her breathing uneven. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. "Scared that if I let you back in, you'll leave again." His gaze darkened with intensity. "I'm not leaving this time," he said, his voice fierce and certain. "I'm not going anywhere." His hand slid into her hair and he leaned down, his lips inches from hers. "Let me love you, Lisa," he whispered. "Let me prove to you that this time, it's forever." Her eyes widened, and for a moment Mike was sure she would pull away. But then her hands slid up his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "Mike." His lips hovered over hers. "Say yes," he breathed. She trembled beneath his touch. "What if you break my heart?" "I won't," he promised. "I swear on my life." Her breath shuddered out, and for a long moment they just stood there, lost in each other's eyes. Then, slowly, Lisa nodded. Mike smiled, relief and fierce joy filling his chest. He leaned down and kissed her, softly at first, savoring the feel of her lips beneath his. But when her hands tightened in his shirt and she kissed him back with equal urgency, something inside him snapped. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him as he deepened the kiss. Her lips parted beneath his, and his tongue slid against hers, tasting her sweetness. Lisa's soft moan sent heat rushing through his veins. His hands slid down to her hips, his fingers digging into her curves as he kissed her harder. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. Her eyes were wide and dark with desire. "Mike," she whispered. He smiled, his thumb brushing her swollen lower lip. "Let me take you out tomorrow," he said. "A real date." She hesitated. "Mike, please," he said softly. "Give me a chance to show you how much you still mean to me." She hesitated for a long moment, then sighed. "Okay." His smile widened. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "I'll pick you up at 7. The next day, Mike showed up at her door again, this time with a single red rose. Lisa opened the door, her eyes widening when she saw him dressed in a tailored suit. "Wow," she breathed. He smiled. "You're stunning." She blushed as his eyes roamed over her dress, a sleek red number that hugged her body perfectly. He handed her the rose. "Ready?" "Yes." He took her to a quiet Italian restaurant, and they talked for hours over wine and pasta. Lisa's laugh was music to his ears, and every time her hand brushed his, he felt that same electric spark. After dinner, they walked through the park where they had shared their first kiss. Mike took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I never thought I'd get this chance again," he said softly. Lisa smiled up at him, her eyes warm and soft. "Neither did I." He leaned down, brushing his lips against hers. The kiss was soft and slow, but the tension between them was undeniable. When he pulled back, he whispered, "Can I see you tomorrow?" She smiled. "Yes." Over the next few weeks, Mike found more reasons to see her. He brought her lunch at work. He called her just to hear her voice. He showed up at her house with flowers and little gifts, things he knew she liked. He even brought her favorite chocolates one night, remembering how she used to love them. And slowly, Lisa began to let down her walls. One evening, as they sat together on her couch, Mike tucked a braid behind her ear and said, "I'm falling for you all over again." Her eyes softened. "Mike, let me love you," he whispered. She smiled, her eyes shining. "Okay." And just like that, Mike knew. He wasn't letting her go this time. He was going to make her his, forever. Lisa had never imagined that her birthday could feel so magical, so breathtakingly perfect, until she stepped onto the rooftop that evening and saw the world Mike had created just for her. The moment the elevator doors slid open, her breath hitched in her throat. The rooftop was transformed into a dreamscape. Soft golden string lights crisscrossed overhead, casting a delicate glow across the night sky. A sea of red and white roses lined the perimeter, their fragrant aroma mixing with the cool night breeze. Small glass lanterns flickered with candlelight, casting soft patterns against the darkened floor. A round table draped in white silk sat at the center beneath the canopy of stars, set with fine china and crystal glasses. Lisa stepped forward, her wide brown eyes shining with wonder, her dark braided hair cascading over her shoulders as the wind toyed with the strands. And then she saw him, Mike, standing at the far end of the rooftop, dressed in a tailored black suit that hugged his tall, lean frame perfectly. His piercing green eyes darkened the moment they landed on her, his gaze filled with something deeper than desire, something more profound than love. He smiled as he approached, holding out his hand. "Happy birthday, Lisa," he said softly, his voice rich and low. Her heart raced as she slid her hand into his. "Mike, what is all this?" He smiled, pulling her close. "I wanted tonight to be special. You deserve it." He led her to the table, pulling out the chair for her. She sat down, her fingers brushing the edge of the linen napkin, as her gaze swept over the luxurious meal laid out before her: creamy pasta, seared salmon, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of vintage red wine. "You remembered all my favorites?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Of course." Mike sat across from her, his gaze never leaving her face. "I remember everything about you, Lisa." Her chest tightened as warmth spread through her veins. As they ate, they talked about everything and nothing: childhood memories, favorite movies, dreams for the future. Mike watched her intently, his green eyes dark with intensity every time she laughed or smiled. His gaze kept drifting to her lips, and Lisa's pulse quickened under his unwavering attention. After dinner, he stood and held out his hand. "Dance with me." She hesitated, her eyes widening slightly. "Here." He smiled. "No one else is here, just you and me." A soft melody began to play from hidden speakers, something slow and romantic. Lisa's heart thudded as she took his hand. He pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her waist as their bodies swayed together beneath the lights. Lisa's cheek pressed against his chest, hearing the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath the crisp fabric of his suit. His hand slid up her back, his fingers brushing the bare skin of her shoulder. "I've never stopped loving you, Lisa," he whispered into her ear. Her breath hitched. She tilted her head to look up at him. His green eyes were molten with emotion. "Mike." His hand slid up to cup her cheek. "I know I hurt you once. I know I let you go when I shouldn't have, but this time, I'm not letting you go." Her lips parted and her chest tightened painfully. "Mike, why now?" His gaze darkened, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "Because I can't live without you." He leaned down and kissed her, softly at first, a gentle exploration of her lips. But when she sighed and leaned into him, his arms tightened around her waist, and the kiss deepened. His tongue brushed hers, and her knees went weak beneath her. When he pulled back, her lips were swollen, her breath ragged. "Mike," he smiled, his forehead resting against hers. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered. Her eyes widened. "Mike, just stay with me," he murmured. "No pressure. I just want to be with you." Before she could answer, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Lisa's breath caught as he opened it. Inside lay a delicate diamond heart pendant, glistening beneath the soft candlelight. Tears stung her eyes. "Mike," he smiled. "Happy birthday, Lisa." He took the necklace from the box and stepped behind her, brushing her braids aside as he fastened it around her neck. His fingers lingered at the nape of her neck before he leaned down, his lips brushing her bare shoulder. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touching the pendant with trembling fingers. "Not as beautiful as you," he murmured against her skin. Lisa turned to face him, her heart pounding wildly. "Why are you doing all this?" "Because I love you." His voice was raw with emotion. "Because I don't want to spend another day without you in my life." A tear slipped down her cheek. Mike reached up and brushed it away with his thumb. "Please, Lisa, give me another chance." Her lips trembled. "What if you break my heart again?" His eyes darkened. "I won't." He pulled her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart. "This is yours. It's always been yours." Lisa inhaled shakily, torn between fear and hope. "Mike." His hand slid behind her neck, his thumb brushing her jaw. "I'm not asking for forever right now. Just give me tonight." Her breath shuddered out, and after a long moment, she nodded. "Okay." His smile widened, and he leaned down, capturing her mouth in another slow, lingering kiss. When they pulled apart, his eyes glowed with warmth. "Come with me." He led her down a flight of stairs to a private suite decorated with rose petals and flickering candles. Lisa's breath hitched as she stepped inside. Mike stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. His lips brushed her ear. "Stay with me," he whispered. Lisa turned in his arms, her hand resting against his chest. "You've already given me so much tonight." "And I'm just getting started," he said, his lips curving into a wicked smile. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and as his arms tightened around her, Lisa knew this time she wasn't going to hold back. This time she was going to let herself fall. And as Mike's lips traced down her neck, as his hands slid over her curves, Lisa knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The storm raged outside, sheets of rain crashing against the windows, the occasional burst of thunder shaking the walls of Lisa's apartment. She sat curled up on the couch, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the flickering light of the television casting soft shadows across the dimly lit room. Her mind was restless, thoughts of Mike swirling uncontrollably through her head. Just as another bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Her heart leapt into her throat. Who would be visiting at this hour in the middle of such a storm? Another knock, louder this time. Slowly she stood, tightening the blanket around her shoulders as she padded barefoot across the wooden floor toward the door. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Mike stood there, completely drenched, rainwater streaming down his chiseled face and soaking through the thin fabric of his white shirt, which clung to his broad chest and powerful arms. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his piercing green eyes burned through her, filled with a wild intensity that made her pulse hammer against her ribs. In his hand, he held a bouquet of red roses, the petals glistening with raindrops. "Mike," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" His jaw clenched, his gaze dark with urgency. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." His voice was raw, rough with desperation. Before she could speak, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Rainwater dripped onto the floor beneath him, but he didn't seem to care. He stood before her, his chest rising and falling heavily, his gaze locked on her wide, beautiful brown eyes. "I know I shouldn't be here," he murmured, his voice low and rough, "but I couldn't stay away." Lisa's heart pounded wildly as he stepped closer. Her eyes darted to the rain-soaked roses in his hand. "Mike, you're soaked." You're going to catch a cold." "I don't care," he said fiercely. "I don't care about anything except you." He dropped the roses on the side table and reached for her, his wet hands sliding around her waist, pulling her close. She gasped as the cold dampness of his shirt pressed against her thin tank top. "Mike," she whispered, but before she could finish, his lips were on hers. The kiss was rough and searing, tasting of rain and longing. His hands slid up her back, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. His mouth claimed hers, his tongue stroking against hers with an intensity that left her breathless. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his wet hair as thunder crashed outside. He kissed her harder, deeper, his hands sliding over the curve of her hips and up her spine, his body trembling as he held her. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath ragged, his green eyes darkened with need. "I don't care about the past," he said hoarsely. "I don't care about the mistakes I made or the years we lost. All I care about is you, right now." Lisa's breath hitched. Her hands slid down his chest, feeling the damp fabric beneath her fingers. "Mike, this is crazy." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "Then let it be crazy. Let me love you, Lisa. Let me prove to you that I'm not going anywhere this time." Her eyes shimmered with tears as her chest tightened painfully. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to surrender completely. But fear clawed at the edges of her heart. "What if you leave again?" she whispered. His eyes flashed with raw emotion. "I won't." His hands slid down to her hips, his grip possessive, protective. "I'm not leaving, Lisa. Not this time." Before she could say another word, he kissed her again, slow and deep, his lips moving against hers with aching tenderness. She melted into him, her body trembling as his hands slid beneath the blanket, finding the bare skin of her back. She shivered beneath his touch, but it wasn't from the cold. His hands moved over her with reverence, as if memorizing every curve, every breathless sigh. Suddenly, he scooped her into his arms, carrying her toward the couch. He sat down with her in his lap, his arms wrapping around her tightly. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured against her ear. "Let me hold you." Her heart thudded painfully. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached up and brushed the wet strands of hair away from his forehead. His eyes softened as her fingers traced down his jawline. "Mike." His lips curled into a small smile. "You're the only thing that makes sense in my life, Lisa." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I don't know if I'm ready." "Then let me wait," he whispered. "I'll wait for you, Lisa, as long as it takes." His hand slid up her back, threading through her braids. "I'm not walking away this time. I'm here to stay." A tear slid down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb, his gaze never leaving hers. Slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. This time, the kiss was soft and sweet, filled with quiet promises and unspoken longing. When she pulled back, Mike smiled, his hand still cradling her face. "Does this mean you'll give me another chance?" he asked quietly. Her lips curved into a small smile. "Maybe." His smile widened. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "I'll take a maybe," he murmured. The storm outside seemed to quiet as they held each other, the sound of the rain fading beneath the steady rhythm of their hearts. As Lisa lay her head against his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this time love wouldn't slip away. The crisp night air was laced with the faint scent of pine and fresh rain as Lisa stepped out of the car, her hand clasped in Mike's strong, steady grip. The sky above them was a blanket of deep midnight blue, speckled with stars that shimmered faintly through the thin veil of clouds. A soft breeze tugged at her long braids as she followed Mike along a narrow path lined with flickering lanterns. Her heart thudded wildly in her chest, though she had no idea why. Mike had been unusually quiet all evening, his green eyes dark and intense every time they met hers. Now, as they approached a charming rustic cabin nestled deep in the woods, her breath caught. The cabin was bathed in a golden glow from within, and delicate white roses and fresh lilies lined the porch, their fragrance mingling with the cool night air. A trail of red rose petals led up the wooden steps to the door, and Lisa's pulse quickened as Mike guided her forward. "Mike, what is this?" she whispered, glancing at him with wide, soulful brown eyes. He didn't answer, only smiled softly as he opened the door and led her inside. The sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. Candles flickered in every corner of the room, casting a soft golden light across the polished wooden floors. Bouquets of roses, tulips, and peonies overflowed from glass vases, their petals shimmering beneath the candlelight. A plush cream-colored rug stretched before a crackling fireplace, and just beyond it was a small table set with crystal glasses and a bottle of champagne on ice. A soft melody played from hidden speakers, filling the air with the delicate notes of a love song. Lisa turned to Mike, her chest tightening painfully. "Mike, what is all this?" He smiled, his green eyes burning with a quiet intensity that made her knees tremble. Slowly, he took her hand and led her to the center of the room. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing tenderly over her cheek. "Lisa," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you." Her heart pounded as he took a step back. Then, to her utter disbelief, he sank down on one knee. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth as her breath hitched. Mike reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. Her hands began to tremble as he opened it, revealing a stunning diamond ring that sparkled brilliantly beneath the candlelight. Tears blurred her vision as Mike's eyes softened. "Lisa," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion in his gaze. "I've loved you since the first moment I saw you. I was young and stupid back then, and I made so many mistakes. But losing you was the biggest mistake of all. For 12 years I lived with the emptiness of not having you by my side. But now you're here, and I'm not letting you go again." A tear slipped down Lisa's cheek as her hands fluttered to her chest. Her lips parted, but no sound escaped. "You are the best thing that's ever happened to me," Mike continued, his eyes shining with pure devotion. "Your smile, your laugh, the way you look at me. It makes me feel alive in a way nothing else ever has. You are my everything, Lisa. My heart, my soul, my reason to breathe." His voice broke slightly as his hand tightened around hers. "I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to build a life with you, Lisa. A family, a future. I want forever with you." He drew in a shaky breath, his gaze unwavering as he held the ring up toward her. "Lisa, will you marry me?" A soft sob escaped her lips as the tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Her heart hammered painfully, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Every memory they had ever shared, every kiss, every heartbreak, every moment of longing and love flashed through her mind in a dizzying rush. Her hands trembled as she stared down at him, at the ring, at the man she had loved for so long. Slowly, she sank to her knees in front of him, her hands cradling his face as she met his gaze. "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Yes, Mike. Yes." His breath caught, and then a wide, radiant smile spread across his face. With a shaky hand, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. As soon as the ring settled into place, Mike surged forward, crushing her against his chest. His lips captured hers in a fierce, passionate kiss that stole the air from her lungs. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair as he deepened the kiss. Tears mingled with the taste of his lips as his hands slid around her waist, pulling her closer. When he finally pulled back, his forehead pressed against hers, his breath shaky and uneven. "You're mine now," he whispered. "Forever." Lisa smiled through her tears. "Forever," she echoed. He kissed her again, softer this time, his hands framing her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He pulled her into his lap, holding her close as the fire crackled beside them. "I love you," he whispered against her ear. "I love you so much." Lisa's eyes shimmered as she brushed her fingers over his jawline. "I love you too, Mike." He smiled, his green eyes dark with emotion as he held her close. "Mrs. Mike Harris," he murmured against her lips. "I like the sound of that." She laughed softly, her heart swelling with warmth as he pulled her closer, his lips trailing along the curve of her neck. The candlelight flickered around them, the soft sound of the music weaving through the air as Mike kissed her again and again, his hands roaming down her back. "You're mine," he whispered between kisses. "Forever?" Lisa's heart raced as she curled against him, her fingers threading through his hair. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, and now it was real. Mike's arms tightened around her, his lips brushing over her temple as they lay together beneath the soft glow of candlelight. As the night stretched on, Lisa rested her head against Mike's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. And in that moment, she knew this was forever. The following weeks passed in a blur of love, excitement, and anticipation as Mike and Lisa threw themselves into planning the wedding of their dreams. From the moment Mike slipped that ring on her finger and claimed her heart forever, he had made it his personal mission to give her a wedding fit for a queen. A day so perfect, so breathtaking, that it would forever be etched into their memories as the most magical day of their lives. Every morning, Mike would wake with Lisa curled against his chest, her soft breath warming his skin, and he would kiss her forehead, smiling at the realization that soon she would be his wife, his, forever. Lisa would stir, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and smile up at him with that heart-melting gaze that made him weak every single time. "Good morning, fiancé," she would whisper, and Mike would pull her even closer, burying his face in her neck as he whispered, "Good morning, future Mrs. Harris." The days were a whirlwind of wedding planners, floral arrangements, cake tastings, and venue selections. Lisa had always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, and Mike was determined to make that dream come true. He had booked the most luxurious venue in the city, a grand glass-walled hall overlooking a breathtaking view of the ocean, where the sunset would cast a golden glow over the entire ceremony. He had hired the best caterers, the finest florists, and the most exclusive designers. But the most magical part of the planning process for Mike was watching Lisa's face light up as they made decisions together. He would sit beside her at the long table in the wedding planner's office, his hand intertwined with hers as they flipped through glossy pages of invitations and sample fabrics. "What about this one?" she would ask, holding up a pale cream-colored card with gold lettering. Mike wouldn't even look at it. His eyes were always on her. "Perfect," he would murmur, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "As long as you love it, I love it." But the moment that stole his heart completely was when Lisa went to try on wedding dresses. The boutique was quiet and filled with the soft scent of fresh lilies and vanilla candles. Lisa stood behind the velvet curtain while Mike sat in a plush chair, his hands resting on his knees as he waited. He was nervous, more nervous than he'd been in his entire life. The curtain slid open, and Mike's breath caught. Lisa stepped out, her figure wrapped in a flowing white gown that hugged her curves perfectly before flaring out into a cascade of lace and satin. The bodice was delicate, with intricate beading and sheer lace along her décolletage. Her hair was gathered into a loose braid, with soft tendrils framing her face, and her wide brown eyes shimmered beneath the soft glow of the chandelier. Mike's heart stopped, his chest tightened, his mouth went dry, and for the first time in his life, he was truly speechless. Lisa bit her lip, her hands clutching the sides of the dress nervously. "Mike," she whispered, "what do you think?" Slowly, Mike rose to his feet, his legs feeling shaky as he closed the distance between them. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing tenderly over her cheek. His green eyes darkened with emotion as he whispered, "You look stunning." Lisa's cheeks flushed a deep pink as she smiled. "Really?" Mike's gaze softened, his hands sliding down her bare arms as his lips curled into a slow smile. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." His lips pressed against her forehead, lingering there for a long moment before he whispered, "Marrying you is the best thing I'll ever do." Tears pooled in Lisa's eyes as she leaned into his touch. "Mike," she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled and brushed his lips across hers. "Let's get married, Lisa. I don't care how big or small the wedding is. I just need you. That's all." Lisa laughed softly, her eyes glistening. "But you've already gone to so much trouble." "You deserve everything," Mike murmured, his hand sliding around her waist as he pulled her closer. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." Over the next few days, they finalized the details. Mike personally arranged for thousands of white roses to be flown in from Italy, because Lisa had mentioned once, years ago, that white roses were her favorite. He had the cake custom designed with delicate lace patterns that mirrored the beading on her dress. He even commissioned a string quartet to play their song as Lisa walked down the aisle. One evening, after a long day of meetings and decisions, Lisa curled up beside Mike on the couch, her head resting against his chest as he traced circles along her bare shoulder. The fire crackled softly in the background, casting a warm glow over them. "Are you happy?" Mike asked, his voice low and tender. Lisa smiled, her fingers brushing over his chest. "I've never been happier." Mike's hand slipped beneath her chin, tilting her face up toward his. His gaze softened as he whispered, "I can't wait to call you my wife." He kissed her slowly, his lips lingering over hers as his hand slid to the small of her back. Lisa melted into him, her heart racing as his mouth moved over hers with a mixture of tenderness and hunger. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, he smiled. "We're almost there," he whispered. "Just a few more weeks." Lisa smiled. "And then we have forever." Mike's hand tightened at her waist as his eyes darkened. "Forever," he repeated. And in that moment, Lisa knew that no matter what life brought them, no matter the challenges or hardships, Mike would always be there. He would hold her hand through the storms and the sunshine. He would love her with everything he had, every single day of their lives. And as they drifted off to sleep together beneath the soft glow of the firelight, Lisa whispered against his chest, "I can't wait to be your wife." Mike smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head as his arms tightened protectively around her. "And I can't wait to be your husband." The night before their wedding was drenched in magic, the kind of raw, heart-pounding magic that only existed between two souls destined to be together. Mike had planned everything perfectly. He took Lisa back to the rooftop where he had given her the delicate diamond necklace for her birthday, the very place where he had poured out his heart and made her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. Now that same rooftop was bathed in moonlight, with hundreds of flickering candles lining the edges and clusters of red and white roses forming a path toward the center. The air was cool and crisp, the soft hum of the city far below, barely noticeable beneath the sound of their hearts beating in sync. Lisa stood at the edge of the rooftop, her eyes wide as she took in the breathtaking sight. Her long hair fell down her back in soft waves, and she wore a white silk dress that hugged her slender figure, the thin straps resting delicately on her shoulders. Mike stood behind her, his eyes dark and filled with emotion as he watched her. He had never seen her look more beautiful. Slowly, he stepped toward her, his hands sliding around her waist from behind as he pulled her flush against his chest. Lisa inhaled sharply, feeling the strength of his arms and the heat of his body seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. "Mike," she whispered, her breath catching. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear as his hands splayed across her stomach. "Do you know how hard it is to wait until tomorrow to make you mine forever?" he murmured, his voice low and rough. Lisa's breath hitched as her heart raced wildly in her chest. "Mike," she breathed, her hands curling over his forearms. He turned her slowly until she was facing him, his green eyes burning with an intensity that made her knees weak. He reached up and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "I can't wait anymore," he whispered. "I need you tonight, Lisa. I need to feel you, to love you, before you become my wife." Her lips parted, her breath trembling as she stared up at him. His eyes darkened, his gaze falling to her mouth. "Kiss me," she whispered. Mike's eyes flashed with hunger before he crushed his lips against hers. The kiss was deep, searing, and filled with desperate need. Lisa melted into him as his arms tightened around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground as he pressed her back against one of the stone columns. His mouth moved over hers with a fierce, consuming passion, his tongue sliding past her parted lips as he deepened the kiss. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as a soft moan escaped her throat. Mike groaned low in his chest, his hands sliding down to cup the curve of her hips as he pressed his body flush against hers. "God, Lisa," he breathed against her lips. He trailed kisses down her jaw, his mouth finding the sensitive spot beneath her ear. Lisa shivered, her eyes fluttering shut as heat pooled low in her belly. "Mike, we shouldn't," she whispered weakly, but her hands were already sliding beneath his shirt, feeling the hard, rippling muscles of his back. Mike's mouth curved into a dangerous smile as he lifted his head and gazed down at her. "You're mine tomorrow, Lisa. But tonight I want to make you mine in every way." He took her hand and led her toward the center of the rooftop, where a plush blanket lay beneath a canopy of stars. Candles flickered around them, casting golden light over their bodies. Lisa's heart raced as Mike slowly unzipped the side of her dress, his eyes never leaving hers. The silk slid down her body, pooling at her feet, leaving her standing before him in nothing but a delicate lace slip. Mike's breath hitched, his gaze darkening as his eyes swept over her. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his hands sliding over her bare shoulders. Lisa's cheeks flushed, but she didn't shy away. She reached for the hem of his shirt and pulled it over his head, revealing the hard, sculpted muscles beneath. Her fingers traced the ridges of his chest, feeling the rapid thud of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "Mike," she whispered. He cupped her face again, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you, Lisa. So much that it scares me sometimes." Tears shimmered in her eyes as her hands slid to his waist. "I love you too." His lips found hers again, softer this time, reverent and tender. He eased her down onto the blanket, his body covering hers as the cool night breeze wrapped around them. Their mouths met in a slow, sensual dance as his hands traced the curves of her body, memorizing every inch of her. Lisa gasped as his mouth trailed down her neck, his hands exploring her with the perfect mixture of tenderness and possession. The stars above seemed to fade as Mike worshipped her body, his lips and hands igniting a fire deep within her that only he could quench. Their bodies moved together beneath the moonlight, each touch and kiss deepening the connection between them until they were completely lost in each other. Lisa's breath quickened as Mike's mouth found the hollow of her throat, his hands tangling in her hair as he whispered her name like a prayer. "I'll love you forever," he whispered, his voice rough and filled with emotion. Lisa's eyes fluttered open, tears slipping down her cheeks as her fingers brushed through his dark hair. "Forever," she breathed. And when he finally claimed her beneath the blanket of stars, their hearts and souls entwined, Lisa knew without a doubt that Mike was her forever. There was no past, no pain, no fear that could touch them now. They belonged to each other, completely, irrevocably. As they lay tangled together beneath the moonlight, their bodies still entwined, Mike pressed a soft kiss to her shoulder and smiled. "Tomorrow I'll marry you." Lisa smiled sleepily as her fingers brushed along his jaw. "And I'll be yours forever." Mike's arms tightened around her as he whispered against her ear, "You already are." And as they drifted off to sleep beneath the stars, Lisa knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, with love, passion, and unbreakable devotion. The day of the wedding dawned with a golden sunrise, casting a soft glow over the sprawling garden where the ceremony was to take place. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every flower petal arranged with care, every candle placed to perfection. But none of it could compare to the breathtaking sight of Lisa as she stood at the edge of the aisle. The air was thick with the scent of roses, white and blush, pink blooms adorning the trellises and cascading down the sides of the chairs. Soft classical music floated through the air, mingling with the quiet murmur of the gathered guests. Lisa stood at the top of the long white aisle, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as her father smiled at her through misty eyes. Her gown was a vision of delicate lace and silk, the bodice hugging her slender frame before flowing into a soft, billowing skirt that trailed behind her like a cloud. Tiny pearls and crystals caught the sunlight, creating a shimmering effect as she moved. Her dark hair was swept up in a loose bun, with soft tendrils framing her face beneath the delicate veil that flowed down her back. Her hands trembled slightly as her father took her arm. "You're beautiful, sweetheart," he whispered. Lisa smiled through the tears that threatened to fall. Her eyes drifted down the aisle, locking onto the man who stood at the altar, the man she was about to marry. Mike stood beneath a canopy of roses, dressed in a crisp black tuxedo with a white rose pinned to his lapel. His green eyes glistened with unshed tears as he watched her. His breath hitched visibly, his chest rising and falling beneath the tailored suit as Lisa began her walk toward him. Time seemed to slow as their eyes remained locked. The world around them faded into a blur of colors and light. Lisa could feel the rapid beat of her heart, the weight of every step carrying her closer to the man who had not only stolen her heart, but had become her entire world. Her father kissed her cheek when they reached the altar, his eyes shining with pride as he placed her hand in Mike's. Mike's hands were warm as they closed around hers, and when Lisa finally met his gaze up close, her breath caught at the raw emotion in his eyes. "You're the love of my life," he whispered, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. Lisa's heart melted at the tenderness in his voice. "You're mine," she whispered back, her voice trembling with emotion. The officiant began to speak, but Lisa barely heard the words. All she could focus on was Mike, his steady gaze, the way his hands tightened protectively around hers, the faint sheen of tears in his eyes. When it was time to exchange vows, Mike's voice was strong and filled with unyielding love. "Lisa," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "from the moment I met you, you changed my life. You taught me how to love, how to trust, and how to believe in something greater than myself. I promise to stand beside you through every challenge, to cherish you every day, and to love you with every breath I take. You are my heart, my soul, my forever. Lisa's vision blurred with tears as her hands trembled in his. Her voice wavered, but her heart was steady. Mike, she whispered, her voice breaking, you have always been the missing piece of my heart. You've shown me what it means to be truly loved. I promise to stand by you through every storm, to lift you up when you're tired, and to love you fiercely every day for the rest of my life. You are my everything. A tear slipped down Mike's cheek as they exchanged rings, his hands shaking slightly as he slid the delicate diamond band onto her finger. Lisa's fingers trembled as she placed the simple gold band onto his hand, feeling the strength of his grip as he held her hand in his. By the power vested in me, the officiant said, smiling warmly, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Lisa barely had time to breathe before Mike's hands were cupping her face and his lips were crashing down onto hers. The guests erupted into cheers and applause as Mike kissed her deeply, his hands threading through her hair as he pulled her closer. Lisa melted into him, her arms sliding around his neck as their hearts pounded together in perfect rhythm. When they finally pulled apart, Mike's forehead rested against hers as they both gasped for breath, smiling through the tears. We did it, Lisa whispered. You're mine, Mike said softly, his thumb brushing over her flushed cheek. Forever. The reception was a blur of laughter and joy. They danced beneath a canopy of twinkling lights, surrounded by friends and family. Mike spun her around the dance floor, his eyes never leaving hers. You're beautiful, he whispered as they swayed to the music, his lips brushing against her ear. Lisa smiled up at him, her heart soaring. You make me feel beautiful. Mike's hands tightened around her waist as he leaned down to kiss her again, his lips soft and full of love. Hours passed in a whirlwind of toasts and dancing, but Lisa's attention never strayed far from Mike. His hand remained securely around hers all night, his gaze burning with affection and possession every time their eyes met. As the evening wound down, Mike led her away from the crowd toward a quiet corner of the garden. He cupped her face, his eyes dark with emotion. I can't wait to spend forever with you, he whispered. Lisa smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Forever starts now. Mike's lips found hers once more beneath the starlit sky, sealing their vows not just with a kiss, but with the unbreakable promise of a lifetime together. They walked away from the garden hand in hand, stepping into the future as husband and wife, knowing that nothing, not time, not distance, not even fate, could ever tear them apart. Mike and Lisa settled into their new life together with a sense of peace and belonging that neither of them had ever known before. Their new house, a beautiful white cottage with blue shutters and a flower-lined path leading to the front door, stood as a symbol of the life they were building together, a life rooted in love, trust, and unwavering devotion. Mornings in their home were filled with the golden light of the sun streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow over the wooden floors and the soft cream-colored furniture they had picked out together. Lisa would wake up to the sound of birds singing outside their bedroom window, her heart swelling with happiness as she rolled over to find Mike still sleeping beside her, his arm draped protectively over her waist. She would trace her fingers along his jawline, marveling at how peaceful he looked when he slept, his dark lashes resting against his cheeks. When he stirred and opened his eyes, a sleepy smile would stretch across his face before he pulled her close, pressing a lazy kiss to her forehead. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," he would whisper, his voice husky and warm. Lisa would smile and bury her face in his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of his skin. Their mornings often began with quiet kisses and whispered confessions of love before Mike would slip out of bed to make breakfast. Lisa would follow him into the kitchen, where he would wrap his arms around her from behind as she poured coffee, nuzzling his face into her neck. "You smell like heaven," he'd murmur, and Lisa would laugh softly, swatting him away playfully. Mike had developed a habit of leaving little love notes for her around the house, slipped beneath her pillow, taped to the bathroom mirror, hidden in the pages of her favorite book. "Thinking of you," one note would say. "I love you more today than yesterday," another would read. Lisa would find them at random moments throughout the day, her heart fluttering each time she unfolded his handwriting. And Mike didn't stop there. He would surprise her with flowers for no reason at all. Lisa would come home from running errands to find a vase of red roses on the dining table with a note that simply said, "Because you're the most beautiful thing in my life." Evenings in their home were sacred. They would cook dinner together, dancing in the kitchen as soft music played in the background. Mike would take her hand, spinning her around as she laughed, her eyes shining with joy. He would pull her close and press his lips to hers, deep and lingering, tasting the sweetness of her love. After dinner, they would sit on the couch with glasses of wine, Lisa curled up against his chest as they watched old movies. Sometimes they didn't even watch the screen. Mike would stroke her hair and whisper sweet nothings in her ear until she drifted off to sleep in his arms. On weekends, they would take long walks through the park hand in hand, talking about their future, the children they wanted to have, the vacations they dreamed of taking, the life they envisioned growing old together. "I want 2 boys and a girl," Mike would say, "with your eyes and your smile." Lisa would laugh and squeeze his hand. "And I want them to have your heart." They spent countless nights lying beneath the stars in their backyard, wrapped up in a thick blanket as the cool night air whispered through the trees. Lisa would rest her head on Mike's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You've made my life beautiful," she whispered one night, her voice soft and full of emotion. Mike's hand slipped beneath her chin, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "And I'll keep making it beautiful," he promised, his gaze burning with intensity. "Every day for the rest of our lives." He kissed her then, slow and deep, their hearts beating in perfect sync beneath the endless sky. Life wasn't perfect. They had their share of challenges. There were days when work was stressful, when they argued over small things, when life felt heavy. But through it all, their love remained the constant anchor that pulled them back to each other. When Mike had a hard day at work, Lisa would run him a hot bath and sit beside him, running her fingers through his hair until he relaxed. When Lisa felt overwhelmed, Mike would scoop her up into his arms and carry her to bed, holding her close until her breathing steadied. They faced life together, side by side, hand in hand. One evening, Lisa came home to find the house dark, except for the flickering glow of candles. The scent of roses filled the air as she followed the trail of petals leading into the living room. Mike stood there, dressed in a crisp white shirt and black trousers, holding a single red rose. "What's all this?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Mike smiled, stepping toward her. "I wanted to remind you that loving you is the greatest gift of my life." He took her hand and led her to the couch, pulling her into his lap as he brushed her hair back from her face. "Lisa, you're the reason I breathe. You filled my life with light and joy. I don't know where I'd be without you." Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she touched his face. "You'll never have to find out," she whispered. Their lips met in a tender kiss, sealing the promise that had already been written into the very fabric of their souls. And as they held each other that night, wrapped in the warmth of their love, they knew that nothing, no storm, no hardship, no distance, could ever tear them apart. Their love was eternal, blessed by the grace of God and strengthened by the bond they had built together. As they lay together beneath the stars that night, Mike pulled Lisa close and whispered, "I thank God every day for you." Lisa smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "I thank him too." Their life was not just a love story, it was a testament to the power of faith, resilience, and the beautiful miracle of second chances. And as they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, the stars above them shining brightly, they knew that their love had been written not just by their hearts, but by the divine hand of Jesus Christ himself. In Jesus' name, they were blessed, their love sanctified and eternal. Special thanks to all the viewers and listeners who have shared this journey with Mike and Lisa, a journey of love, redemption, and the beautiful promise of forever. May you all find a love as deep and true as theirs.